Good afternoon. Welcome to Sustainable Industry Digital, driving the circular economy. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got 90 minutes this afternoon, and we're going to cover a really interesting topic around how we can drive the circular economy, particularly looking at collaboration between public and private sector, and how we can really turbocharge some of that value. I'm joined today by three contributors. We got Thomas McDonald, who is a reader in sustainable materials from the Henry Royce Institute. Dan Noakes, who is the Systematic Challenge Lead Circular Economy at the CPI, and he's representing the Centre for Expertise in Advanced Materials and Sustainability, known as SEAMS by many of you, and Rob Snaith, who's the Principal Consultant for the Circular Economy at Ricardo. Now, those three are going to introduce themselves in more detail in a moment. How we're going to run today's session is I'm going to invite each one of those contributors for a quick intro piece around what they do and where they sit in the space, and then we're going to open up for a 60-minute open conversation orbiting that central topic. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to Thomas for a bit of an intro in terms of what he does, and ask him to give us an overview of Henry Royce's footprint, its key capabilities across these different universities. Thomas, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. As Nick's already said, I'm Tom McDonald. So I'm a reader in sustainable materials, based within the Henry Royce Institute, the hub building at the University of Manchester. I have research interest in the area of sustainable plastics is one of the big areas I'm really focused on. I'll touch on that later on in some of the discussions when we're talking about some of the different projects that are ongoing. But at the start, I just want to tell you a bit more information about the Henry Royce Institute. So the Henry Royce Institute is the UK's National Institute for Advanced Materials Research and Innovation. It's a collaborative partnership between many different universities, and a hub is located at the University of Manchester. It also includes some non-universities, such as the National Nuclear Lab and the UK Atomic Energy Authority. And some of the universities it includes are Cambridge, Imperial College, Leeds, Liverpool, Oxford, Sheffield, and of course, Manchester. So the idea here is you've got institutes that have a wide range of different expertise across a range of advanced materials areas, and it's really about providing cutting edge research for materials development in applications areas as broad as energy, healthcare, manufacturing and electronics. And the Royce's mission is to really accelerate the development of these advanced materials. And our national footprint means that actually UK industries can come in and access the critical capabilities we have and provide infrastructure and innovation support. So the way the Royce is grouped is we have different theme areas, research areas. I'm not going to list all of them, you can see them on the website, but some of them include advanced metals processing, atoms to devices, biomedical materials, and the one I lead is called chemical materials design. And it's really trying to align the capabilities that we have within the Henry Royce to these different challenge areas. And one of the big ones, of course, is sustainability, because sustainability is an undercutting theme that runs across all different areas of materials design. So I think I'll pick up some other pieces later on, Nick, if you want. But I think that's the key aspects of the Henry Royce Institute. And I'll talk more about the chemical materials design theme later on.
Wonderful. Thank you. Appreciate that. And moving on now to Dan, if I could get an introduction to the SEAMS initiative, and if you've got any examples of some of the collaborations that you've that's bearing fruit, that'd be great to hear more about that as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nicholas. Hi, all. This is Dan Noakes, the Systemic Challenge Lead for Circular Economy at CPI, representing the SEAMS group today. And Thomas's introduction is really helpful because effectively that shows how you bring together various centres or expertises, which is exactly what SEAMS is about. This is the Centre of Expertise in Advanced Materials and Sustainability. And it's a collaboration between the Rochdale Development Agency, Centre for Process Innovation, the Henry Royce Institute in Manchester, the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, the Manufacturing Technology Centre, National Composite Centre, and the National Physics Laboratories and the University of Manchester. So there's 7 centres there effectively that have been brought together because of this great initiative created in Greater Manchester by the Rochdale Development Agency. It couldn't have been made possible without them and how this has been funded. So this is effectively the public purse working strongly with the research organisations and innovation communities to support businesses, large or small, but with a strong focus on SMEs and small businesses, because actually it's hard to develop in this space what we call the hardware space for investment, because it requires capex and it requires significant expenditure. It usually requires capability and equipment that is expensive to buy and isn't necessarily available so frequently or easily without deep pockets. So these centres have been brought together effectively to be accessed by the industry, by the innovation community in the Greater Manchester region. And you can come to us effectively as a single door to all of these centres, and we will help direct you to where the best support capability and technical expertise is to help your businesses commercialise sustainable materials or develop whatever your innovative ideas and effectively pull them through the invention and innovation stage towards commercialisation and scale up. So effectively, we're solution providing to whatever problems you might have in the materials space. Just to cover on where we've got so far, the programme has been in delivery. We've got over 50 companies with 40 projects identified, half of which are in delivery, and a third of those are actually circular economy. And one of those projects, an example of those, is recycling of carbon fibre and glass fibre. So these are complex materials, and we talk about complex materials because these aren't necessarily the post-consumer wastes like plastics that are a bit more simpler to recycle. These are materials that are tightly bound together, and the project we have with Signet is a demonstration activity where we have large capex items that will help to break apart the complexity of a composite material without damaging those individual parts. And the thought piece is those materials can then be upgraded and go back into the circular economies that then feeds existing manufacturing industry, so we can displace some of those raw materials from virgin feedstock.
Wonderful. It sounds like an incredible project, and when you list out all of the different institutions and ecosystems, we are very lucky, especially so in the Greater Manchester area with the SEAMS project. And that brings us on to Rob, who's done a lot of work, I know, with collaborating public and private sector. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you've done and some of the successes you've had.
Yep, thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here. So yeah, I'm Rob Snaith. I'm a principal consultant in the circular economy team at Ricardo. Ricardo, for those who haven't come across us, are a global engineering and environmental consultancy, and we have technical teams covering pretty much anything you can think of that would fall under that quite broad title, really, description. So I'm in the circular economy team, like I say, which sits within our sustainability practice, alongside other sister technical teams who we work very closely with, such as Net Zero, LCA, Life Cycle Assessment, ESG, supporting organisations looking at their environmental and social governance, compliance issues and programmes towards that, and also wider programme management, which the team there does a lot of work with kind of local and national government bodies to deliver and design and deliver and monitor programs to support organizations through their kind of environmental requirements and kind of incubators and accelerator type projects that they work on as well. So the circular economy team's work is, we're about half and half public sector, private sector, I would say, and the public sector stuff that I kind of lead mostly on at the moment covers technical research, policy and strategy research, and recommendations for government bodies in Scotland. As you can probably hear, I'm kind of Scotland based myself, and that's where our team has grown up from. But we also do a lot of work for the UK government, the European Commission we're doing a lot for at the moment, and other international governments as well. And the private sector work that we do, which kind of dovetails quite nicely with that, involves supporting organizations to understand what their local policy and regulatory context means for them in terms of what they need to do for compliance in the markets that they want to sell into, and then supporting those organizations to develop their own internal policies and strategies, and going the next step to identifying and investigating and then implementing, delivering action plans for them to build opportunities to build circular economy practices into their own products and services and business models. So we're happy to have conversations with anyone in any sector on how we can help look at those things. Really, we do have a particular focus in a few key sectors: manufacturing and automotive, the rail sector we're doing a lot on at the moment, a lot in bioeconomy, construction, and then across all sectors we have a specific sub-team of experts focused on sustainable packaging support, so looking at what packaging options are, and again helping to understand what the compliance requirements are, but then helping to take people beyond compliance and look at best practice and kind of really kind of get ahead of the game in terms of what those options are for them, really. So coming to the idea of public-private collaboration, it really is key to everything that we do, I would say. The vast majority of the policy and regulatory recommendations that we make as part of those kind of public sector kind of funded research projects involve a huge amount of stakeholder engagement with relevant industry players of all sizes, from trade associations right down to SMEs on the ground, not only to gather information and insight, but also to present and validate any kind of recommendations, any potential policy recommendations that we might make. So through open discussion, we try to see if those recommendations are actually going to be workable in practice on the ground for people, and then to mold those recommendations in the spirit of co-creation, so understanding where the challenges are and what the routes to potentially overcoming those challenges are going to be. So we believe it's only through that kind of collaborative co-creating approach that you end up with policy that meets the ambitious targets that we need to meet to be able to drive towards a more circular economy, a more sustainable world, but also are actually practicable as well, and are actually going to be able to be delivered kind of in practice, and have the support through that kind of co-creation and kind of buy-in of the industries in which those policies are going to be kind of felt most. So yeah, that's a kind of very brief introduction to the work that we do. So yeah, happy to get into the rest of the conversation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, we've got lots of ground to cover then, and that's a really good overview from you three in terms of what you do and where you sit in that space. Now we're going to open up for the group discussion, and I'm going to kick us off with the sort of central question we're going to orbit. Is a two-part question: a how and a what. Thomas, if I could start with you to kick us off. So how do you see collaboration between research institutions, local government initiatives and businesses shaping the circular economy, and particularly what opportunities are there for businesses to get involved?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah. I think Rob's kind of touched on both Rob and Dan have touched on these points, and I think really the key is collaboration, isn't it? The collaboration across the sector. I mean, as research institutions, and we're really well positioned to obviously provide cutting edge knowledge and capability to help tackle some of those kind of challenges around materials design, circularity, looking at how you can recycle materials, as the example Dan's already given on how you can recycle composite materials. These are all spaces I think you have to have that collaboration, because a research institute is well positioned to provide the technical expertise, but without the support from the business partners, it's hard to necessarily know what are the key challenges for the application. You know, what are the material requirements, what's the cost point, and so on. And I think really for the Henry Royce, and particularly in the research area I lead in chemical materials design, we're very well placed to provide the technical expertise and the research infrastructure. So some of the things we've got is automation. So for companies looking to exploit automation, we can provide workflows, integrated workflows to deploy that in a materials development space. And also one we have here in Manchester is a really nicely integrated workflow for plastic circularity. So an example here is even in something like a commodity plastic like polyethylene, there's still big challenges with knowing how to obtain high quality recyclate. So we've been running a project in collaboration with Unilever and a company called Bright Green Plastics. So again, pulling in two different companies in different parts of the supply chain who are then well positioned to collaborate in a non-competitive way, can actually share insight in terms of what are the key aspects that matter to both a company producing recycled plastics and a company trying to use those. And then we as the research institute were really well positioned to then dig into the materials and understand some of the key properties, some of the key parameters there. So I think again, without that wider stakeholder engagement, as Rob was speaking about, it's really impossible to understand the material flow which underpins a circular economy. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity, I think, to try and pull the different stakeholders together.
Yeah, if I could just a quick question on that. You spoke there about the example with Unilever and having one of their suppliers involved. We talk a lot about the importance of systems thinking and not necessarily looking at those in silos. How first of all, how did that come about? And second of all, what were some of the advantages of having some of the different tiers of that supply chain involved as opposed to just discrete pockets of innovation?
Yeah, so this was a kind of problem-led project that started with a really small-scale collaboration with Unilever, and at that stage I was based at the University of Liverpool, and so Unilever were pitching on some of their problems, some of the challenge areas they have. Like all companies, they want to move to more circular feedstocks, so moving away from virgin feedstocks, and so they were looking to collaborate with academia, who then have, of course, we had that capability of, really high spec, high performance equipment and the expertise to look at, say, structure property relationships in materials. So that's how it started. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about the Henry Royce Institute and also with SEAMS, as Dan spoke to, is there's lots of opportunity for companies to come in and do a relatively small project to kind of sense out the space, feel out the space and explore the opportunity. So that was kind of how this project arose. And then there was a larger funding opportunity. So once we built that partnership, there was a larger funding opportunity, which was in the UKRI Smart Sustainable Plastic Packaging call, which was £60 million of funding that was allocated across the packaging, the circularity space. And so we had a grant awarded in that. And at that stage, we really wanted to then, of course, broaden out our understanding along the supply chain, because again, as I mentioned before, circularity of materials obviously has to consider what's going to happen at the end of life, and actually how design of packaging informs its recyclability is absolutely critical there. So yeah, so for us, it was just we were able to learn from our commercial collaborators. And then we could then shape our research to really align to the problems they were experiencing. So for example, some of the outputs of that project are IPL Bright Green actually invested in a new wash plant. So they identified some of the opportunities from our project that showed they could have further improved the quality of their material. And so they configured a new wash plant design in line with the recommendations that our project put forward. And then also Unilever use a lot of the data science we've generated and the relationships between material properties and performance to inform their material science work they do within the company. So again, for me, I was really excited as an academic to have a shape on the real world, and I've learned a lot also about the real world challenges of those materials. So I think there's many different examples like that. But I think just to pull it together, the key part is the infrastructure we had within the Henry Royce Institute was that we have an integrated workflow for material circularity. So we can take materials, take plastics, put them through really detailed characterization, and then also do things like modeling recycling. And that's because of that combination of different capabilities we have here.
Brilliant. And just before I bring Dan in, I can see him furiously scribbling notes there, ready to get involved. Just to note, everyone on the call that we'll be sending out all the links to the relevant things that are discussed on today's call, and we have carved out 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you've got anything relating to any of these points, happy to circle back and pick this up at the end. So please do use the Q&A function to fire those across. Dan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. So again, just leading from what Thomas was saying, I think it's really important to differentiate seams from current programs across the UK, where circular economy has already been very much in the swing, and it all started for the need for a waste industry and the UK landfill tax, because the UK is an island and we have only so much landfill space. And once the landfill tax came in and landfill allowances for local governments, you had an economic environment that suddenly drove value in the material, albeit a negative driver, so much so that you get taxed to dispose. What it actually created was an economic environment for businesses to move into a void or a space whereby they could take on some sort of financial investment to overcome the costs in turning those materials that are once wastes back into something that is valuable for what is a circular economy. And we understand that mainly as recycling. But I come back to it's generally a heavy capex hardware exercise, and therefore the risk is significant. What Seams is here, Seams is it isn't looking necessarily at the large volume materials that we understand in post-consumer waste. It's almost looking at the other materials, because they're advanced materials. Quite often they're designed to last longer than your average material that had come through a household, and actually they're put together at levels of complexity that needs an understanding from an engineering, from a chemistry, from maybe a biology perspective. It's a different approach to circular economy, that one says things need to last longer, but it still says at their end of life they still need to be recyclable and turn back into something else. So if I look at how we might cluster these complex items together, things like batteries, things like photovoltaics and solar, we can only see there's going to be more and more and more of those as we push towards a renewable energy grid. And it's how do we work with local businesses to fill that void now, not for those large volume materials that have a smaller margin, but actually there's a high value in these problematic materials that we've otherwise been sending abroad for other countries to recover the precious or commodity materials from. How do we do that here in the UK? And Seams has worked very closely with, as I say, those 20 plus projects we've currently got in operation now, to see what that looks like in the future. How can we support those? Again, the funding from RDA has allowed us to support those businesses and support ourselves. We come together on a almost daily basis now to really thrash out what the vision piece looks like. But the opportunity is to be able to influence policy, to be able to have a vision that sets forward a plan for the Greater Manchester region and make value and create those jobs and bring the inward investment, because we understand it takes on average between 15 and 20 years to turn an invention into commercialization. And actually, if the likes of the research organizations and the local authorities and the local businesses don't come together, and I like the mention of Unilever there as well, because when you're trying to achieve circular economy, you have to do it in circular supply chains. The whole supply chain needs supporting, because even those big businesses recognize that it's a non-viable space to move into currently, because the cost basis doesn't work right down the value chain. So this is a perfect place for research organizations to come in with the public sector and really lift up that opportunity in industry and almost fill the gaps or be the glue in the supply chain that allows the whole thing to work towards what we class as a circular business model. And that is when the economics of a circular system outpaces the economics of a linear system. So we stop putting to landfill. So we start using those materials more wisely, and we start supporting those businesses in the local region to generate more profit out the back end from those materials that would otherwise be lost in the system.
And just before I hand over to Rob, I was just keen to pick up on something you said there around the value piece and around working with those lower tiers in the supply chain. What are you finding is the cut through? How are you getting those tier 3, tier 4 suppliers engaged when it might seem a bit of away from the primes that are sort of taking the spotlight? Where are you seeing some effective language to get them involved?
As always, funding is attractive. And we've got business development teams on the ground effectively going out into the Greater Manchester area, understanding who the local businesses are, understanding what their issues are, really trying to connecting with the materials and advanced materials community. And we've been holding very effective events, some beautiful buildings in Rochdale, where we've attracted those small businesses in alongside very large businesses, with the understanding that we're there to effectively create networks and communities and be a voice for industry. Hopefully we can be listening voice to the point that we understand that there may be need for policy or future funding, that we can go and talk to Rochdale Development Agency and other local agencies, as well as the public purse from a national perspective, because effectively we're doing the job for a national perspective as well. And it's bringing everyone into the same room. So even though funding and technical expertise, capability and equipment is attractive, I think there's more we can do in terms of a business services, and that's equally as important, because it's about driving that innovation ecosystem.
Yeah, and it's that ecosystem, it's the network, it's the thinking in a circular way about value and where it sits. So yeah, it's really, really important. Rob, sorry, over to you.
Yeah, lots of points to make on kind of what both Thomas and Dan have both said there. I was going to ask both of you a question actually, but I think you've answered it quite nicely, Dan, just about with the organisations that you're engaging with or that are coming to your respective programmes. Has kind of the need for policy compliance been one of their drivers? But I think Danny answered that quite nicely when you were talking about the landfill tax there, which obviously answers that in the positive, and that really is a really good example again of the kind of the systems thinking, the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach that's needed to really drive a circular economy forward, or to be able to embed circular economy practices. And there was a really interesting piece of research which came out just 2-3 weeks ago from Zero Waste Scotland, who are the Scottish government's one of the Scottish government's kind of research arms, I suppose, and that looked specifically at the circular economy ecosystem within Scotland, but I think the learnings apply kind of globally, really, and it kind of backed up a lot of what kind of people in my circles kind of feel instinctively, and kind of knowing that the kind of one of the major barriers and the underlying kind of element of that ecosystem is how we measure value as a society. And in a linear economy, value is purely based on, and traditional linear economy value is purely based on the price, without kind of factoring in those externalities like kind of social, environmental kind of impacts of kind of getting the material out of the ground in the first place, and the processing costs, and then the end of life management costs as well. And factoring in those externalities creates a whole different picture of what value actually is, and makes circular economy approaches and practices much more attractive, commercially attractive. And the landfill tax is an excellent example of that, where the actual cost of dealing with material at the end of its first useful life is now kind of needs to be factored into people's business models as well. So I think that's a really strong example of why circular economy approaches are important to help people kind of get to where we want them to get to, from my idealistic circular kind of point of view, but also that when you actually really think about the bigger picture, it does make business sense as well. And it's making that's a large part of the engagement work that we do, either for kind of public sector funded projects engaging with businesses, or actually just working with businesses themselves to help them kind of develop their own kind of internal discussion around why circularity is worth investigating and driving forward. It's looking at that bigger picture of what actually can we look at in terms of cost savings by implementing these kind of circularity opportunities, and not just cost savings, but are there new kind of business models, new revenue streams that we might be able to look at there, such as the industrial symbiosis ideas of the kind of byproducts or kind of waste products from our manufacturing process might actually be a very valuable kind of raw material for that factory next door, for example. So it's kind of making those connections and kind of getting people just to think outside of the box a little bit. The biggest threat to any of the work that we do is the sentiment that we do things this way because we've always done things this way. So it's just asking that question, why, and then why, and then why, and then why, and getting really deep down into that, and then unpicking what the answers to kind of thinking in a slightly different way might be, I suppose. So yes, that was one of the points I wanted to make. I think the other really interesting thing, coming back to what you were saying, Thomas, is the idea of performance of products as well. When we're working with businesses to think about the way that their end product or kind of processes with getting towards that end product are designed in the first place, we think about how can you provide the same level of performance but using kind of fewer materials or using less environmentally impactful materials. So that understanding of what that fundamental performance needs to be from a product or a service or a component going into that product, in the example of the work that you were talking about, is a really kind of important piece of the puzzle. And that, so the understanding from projects like you guys are working on, has to be kind of part of that overall conversation, as well as understanding of the environmental impact of the different options through things like life cycle assessment and those kind of ideas as well. So that was just something else which kind of links in nicely to that overall picture. And then coming back to the point of collaboration, it's only through open information sharing and programs such as the Rice Institute are running, and SEAMS, those kind of place-based approaches as well, getting people talking who actually have the capability to potentially share resource streams or look at those industrial symbiosis ideas or share knowledge and share good practice. That's the only way that any of this can work, really, with that holistic understanding of all of the different elements needing to play together.
Yeah, I'd complete. Can I just follow on Nick quickly on that?
Course, yeah.
I think as you were saying, Rob, I think that's one of the big opportunities, and I think one of the big changes that we can try and drive, all of us across the sector, is that open sharing of information. I think there is a tendency, of course, in the commercial space, people want to have a competitive advantage, but often when we're thinking about a circular economy, if you keep that competitive advantage, the ability to reach sufficient scale is blocked off. And so I think there's got to be that open collaboration that really allows something to grow to enough size to then be able to be more circular. And I think there's ways to avoid some of that. Is obviously, as I mentioned before, and some of the examples we've heard of before, is also looking at adjacent parts of the supply chain where you're working with a company either side in the supply chain. I think that then both companies can realize value in that. I think the other one, and you touched on this as well, Rob, is moving materials between sectors. So a lot of spaces. So one of the things we've done a lot of work on in my group, and also in the Royce in the plastic space, is on packaging. So we've got very high volumes of material and packaging. But I think, again, it's like, when can we move materials, recycled materials, say from packaging into the automotive sector, or into another sector where there's a driving force for recycled materials. The material requirements are different, and actually that's an opportunity, because sometimes when you've got a circular economy, particularly in plastics, there is a stage when the properties of the material can diminish. But then when is it now suitable for use in another space? And again, that is a nice collaboration that allows you to work as two companies in different spaces that actually now you can move waste. Did you have anything you wanted to add on that, Rob? You just unmuted.
Yeah, I think it kind of leads on nicely to how the kind of work that you're talking about can then feed back into kind of government organizations as well, because that the movement of materials between sectors, between sites within the same sector, for example, if you look at it purely on a kind of geographical level, there are, if something just makes perfect sense, I've got this stuff, you need it, let's do it. But if it's classified as waste on my site, then there's a lot of kind of regulatory hurdles to get over from moving that waste a couple hundred meters across the site, basically. So where there are potential opportunities like that identified, that's where that kind of collaboration piece can come back in to see, is there something we can do to make this a bit simpler? Can the regulations be amended a little bit in this specific circumstance, or that kind of thing? So that's where, again, having those open lines of communication through projects like the work that we do and the work that you guys are doing is really helpful to say, just can we have a conversation at the very least to see how we can start to kind of unpick some of these challenges as well, to potentially realize this massive opportunity of kind of value retention for the materials that we're looking at. So it's a really, really kind of strong point to feed into the overall theme of the discussion today, is just that those open lines of communication just kind of make everything a lot easier, basically, to at least understand where the challenges are and begin to think about how to overcome those challenges.
And are there any areas that stand out as being excelling in that space? Are there any verticals or any hotspots that you can pinpoint as a case study in where that's working? Maybe not at scale, but
so the example I gave is something we are looking at, is moving. So, and again, this touches on some of the points Dan was bringing up around the landfill tax, and how landfill tax created very strong incentives for new behaviours to arise. So one of the ones we see is the kind of discussion around recycled content in car manufacture that's underway. And so this is driving some interesting new considerations for automotive sector to secure more recycled feedstocks. And I think, again, we've got a lot of plastics in the packaging space. It's where we can take material from that sector when the values diminish potentially, and then move it into the automotive sector. And I think this is where us on the academic side, I think we can really help bridge that gap, because there's quite a few technical challenges there about how do you take one material design for one application, and what can you do to modify its properties, understand its properties now that it's been recycled, to bring that quality or bring that performance up to meet a different set of specifications. So I think that's a really nice example. But I don't know if Rob or Dan, if you have some other examples of kind of intersectorial materials transfer that you can imagine growing, Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I think I'm going to strip it back to. So I've got a background in municipal solid waste, and when you're trying to recycle, the hardest thing to recycle is what's in a black bin bag, what otherwise would be going to landfill. It's called mixed waste recycling. You know what the easiest product is to get out the door on a recycling plant. It's always the metals. It's aluminium always sells, ferrous always sells. The plastic's harder, but depending on quality and quantity, it's doable. Certain plastics are more valuable than other plastics. Some plastics are really intolerant to contamination from other plastic streams, where there's other plastic classifications that actually work and can be recycled together. When you start bringing in things like biodegradable and compostable materials, it doesn't actually matter what those biodegradable and compostable materials are and how they differ, because if their end of life option is the same, they can both be treated in the same in-vessel composting or anaerobic digestion or home composting system. That's a new way to classify them. So I think what I encourage is things that are successful seem to have, and I'm yet to be disproved, the greatest number of end of life options, because where you are in the world, whatever invested recycling systems or reuse systems you have, materials do come their end of life. And Thomas made a great point that plastics, over a certain time, the more mechanical processing you do, they degrade, the polymer chain breaks down, so they have to be recycled. So we never know what sort of recycling system is going to be in a given region. And we here in the UK, we've got a world-leading recycling infrastructure, but yet we still have discrepancies up and down the country. And so it's how do we design these future materials to have the greatest number of end-of-life options? I think I always come to it doesn't necessarily matter. Although we know that materials like metals are readily recyclable and should be infinitely recyclable, generally it comes down to what's the quantity and what's the composition. You can generally get value out of anything as long as you put the right investment into it, reducing your OPEX and doing it on the right scale. And actually, plastics is a really interesting one, because mechanically recycling, we're probably not achieving what we should be doing globally. But actually, when it comes to the demand for the chemical sector and the material sector for feedstock, all of a sudden, the carbon-carbon bonds in polymers and plastics could become a rich source of sustainable feedstock for other industries. And Rob touched on that as the crossover. I think it's important to do is to come from, and we'll encourage companies to come into SEAMS with their problem, because we're here to solve your solution. You don't have to try and think it out, because we've got all these centres and expertise that can think it out on your behalf. But what's important to know is, are you coming from, we need a specific material focus, or are you coming from the push of, we have a waste that needs dealing with? And so traditionally, we've seen at both ends of the circular economy scale, those from the waste industry trying to produce a material that's good enough to be bought by someone, and then those at the existing buying raw materials to go into manufacturing end of the circular economy that say, if you can produce a secondary raw material that is good enough, i.e. meets a technical specification and achieves end of waste, then we're willing to have that negotiation around value, supply chain value, and price. That bit in the middle is actually the hardest thing to do. And I think that's where the research organizations can come in and bring in that material characterization piece. How do we upgrade certain materials? How do we rebuild polymers? In terms of carbon fiber and glass fiber composites, it's how do you resize fibers? Those sorts of challenges have yet to be addressed, and how you break down materials is equally as important to how you put them back together again. So all of this, I would say, we're venturing into new areas of material science that's going to need that deep tech knowledge and understanding to support industry to pull this through. Because you do have entropy in the system, you do see deterioration of materials, and somehow we've got to overcome that cost basis to be able to pull through the opportunity in the value of the intrinsic value of those materials, and do it in a way that doesn't cost the earth, doesn't break the planetary boundaries, and doesn't produce ridiculous amount of carbon emissions.
Can I just, I mean, I'd made a note of a point I wanted to raise, and I think what you've talked about perfectly kind of aligns with it. It's basically standardizing recycled materials to some degree. And I think, because if you think about it, if you're an organization, if you're a company and you want to use more recycled feedstock, you want to be operating in a more circular manner, you have to take a material that now has more variability. Recycled materials are innately more variable because they are contaminated to some degree depending on the process. They can be mixed polymers, mixed materials, that they are more variable. They've been processed in a different way. So there's always an uncertainty for a company wanting to take that. And when it comes to procuring those materials and selecting them, their benchmark is a virgin material typically. And so there's a really great opportunity, as you were saying, Dan, between the company that produces, that is often being requested by the potential customers to obtain virgin-like properties, which are up here, and they've got properties that are lower. But actually, what's required is a key point. You don't necessarily need the virgin-like properties. Again, what can be tolerated? And I think that is, again, like a space where, as you talked about in the SEAMS project on the recycling carbon fiber, that's one of the areas we're trying to tackle. That's what we're trying to do in recycled plastic packaging. I think that's a really nice way that you can have this cross-sector collaboration and the expertise pulled in. And so some of the things we're trying to do is come up with tighter specifications for, say, recycled plastics for use in packaging. Because again, there is a lot, the technical data sheets for recycled plastics used in packaging are currently often very limited and don't give the company that wants to use those materials enough information. And I think this is probably something that's common across a lot of the kind of recycled feedstocks, that there's that gap between what can I use effectively in substituting for virgin materials.
Yeah, a really interesting mix between the needs and the wants there. I think that raises another interesting point, which is sort of on the collaboration piece. We've spoken a lot about the collaboration between different companies and different organizations and public-private sector. What about the internal collaboration? What about ways that you can sort of, as a read across to that, the challenges as you're defining them? How are companies, people on the call perhaps today, creating those feedback loops internally to understand what the procurement team are buying and why they're buying it, or what their customers or suppliers might necessarily need or want? But how are those effective feedback loops being created internally within those organizations to help solve some of those challenges?
Well, I mean, we do. It's a great question, Nick. We do a lot of work, and I'm talking now as equally as CPI as I am talking as SEAMS, with the healthcare sector, and it's quite interesting because you look at the NHS has really stuck its neck out and says it wants to be net zero by 2040 and all direct carbon emissions, and net zero by 2045 and all indirect carbon emissions. And it's brought something in around its scope 3 emissions for its supply chain to sort out this. Everyone's scope 1 and 2 emissions is the NHS's scope 3 emissions from the materials and products that they procure. They've brought in something called evergreen procurement. They've effectively said that you need to start telling us what your scope 2 and scope 3 emissions are as part of the tendering process for you to work with us. So they're a huge procurement body, but they also a fairly significant waste producer, and circular economy for them is absolutely key for them to A, drive down their emissions, and B, to be more increase their efficiencies in the system. So you're looking there at green procurement, and effectively the things that they invest in will be the things that will succeed in the marketplace. So you can look at that as an example for local authorities to do very much the same, because that is a positive feedback loop into the system. you do need to invest in green technologies. You do need to invest in green materials. And without that additional money coming in, and sometimes, sadly, there will be a price premium. But we're already seeing, whether it's the UK plastic tax, or extended producer responsibility, the cost of the negative externalities that Rob was talking about are starting to be factored in now into supply chains. So companies are looking to do the alternative thing or the sustainable thing to avoid some of those cost burdens. And I am encouraged to hear some big names in industry saying that you will start to see eventually cost parity between those that are the incumbent and the more polluting products and materials in the market versus those sustainable alternatives that are emerging that actually will achieve some level of economies of scale, but will get the support, the kind of support through green procurement that are desperately needed, and will invite people into this space so that we can address that cost barrier. I think that's absolutely key, that procurement definitely plays a role in big organizations.
Yeah, and I think your example there of the NHS, so that they've got something like 88,000 suppliers. It's an incredible number. So the scale there is the challenge. Rob, I'd love to bring you in because I know Ricardo might not necessarily make on the same scale, but your products are in use for a long time. So there might be some sort of low value manufacturers on the line here. How do some of those challenges reflect for a low volume, high value manufacturer like Ricardo?
I will admit that's not really my area of the business, Nick. So I wouldn't like to to talk to that too specifically. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a scientist, so I have to be very careful of not getting out of my depth very quickly in these kind of conversations. But I think an example that I can make, which kind of speaks to the point, we did a piece of work for a Japanese automotive OEM equipment manufacturer who were kind of very active in their home market, but also Europe and the US. And we were developing help them develop their kind of circular economy strategy, basically. And what they asked us to do initially as part of that was a series of internal workshops with the executive, the directorate, and the procurement team, and the kind of design and engineering teams, and the sales and marketing teams as well, but very separate workshops. And we went back to them and said, if you do that, you're going to have kind of 4 very separate sets of outputs which don't necessarily kind of completely align. So we structured what they asked us to do and had some individual kind of sessions with those teams, but also kind of wider workshops across the teams as well. And I think that kind of really speaks to the initial question that you asked there, Nick, of how to kind of incorporate that kind of internal collaboration, because that's the only way, getting the team speaking to each other. So the design team want to make a certain material substitution so there's less recycled content in the trucks that they're kind of manufacturing, for example. But the procurement team can then say, yeah, but that's difficult because these are the suppliers we always use for that and they don't offer that, so we need to have some engagement there. So you need that. It's all about those kind of conversations happening at the same time, with that kind of same kind of aim in mind, I suppose. And sitting above it all has to be the kind of the top level support from the executive, from the directorate, to say, this is what we want to do. We want to work towards a more kind of circular way of doing things. There's no such thing as a circular business and a linear business, but there are circular practices which can be kind of put into place to help us move kind of closer to the direction of being more resource efficient and less reliant on kind of materials which probably will become scarce at some point in the future as well. That has to be driven from the top level so that everybody understands this is the way the company's going, and only then can you start to have the kind of the give and take and the open conversations that are needed between those kind of different departments, which quite often can be quite siloed, to be able to come up with those kind of joint solutions of what's actually going to be kind of doable in the future. And that's the kind of thing that you can build into a nicely structured, nicely presented kind of strategy. This is our overall aim. These are the objectives within that aim, and these are the individual actions that we're going to take to meet those objectives. And we know that these are realistic because we've spoken to all the relevant people, the people that need to be involved in making these things happen. So that's the way it can work, and I've seen it work in kind of various projects that we've worked on. I've also seen it not. I've also seen the alternative not work, because that's the way that the company wanted to do things, and it just people don't always agree without being able to have that kind of open conversation, basically. So it's really top-down driven kind of ambition and aims, but also that kind of open communication between all departments that are going to be involved in the actual implementation of the things that you look at.
And do you see it? Did you approach that differently to you would any sort of traditional change program? Because it sounds like you're trying to change people's behaviours by making them feel differently about the work they do. So was there any sort of aha moments you had during that project?
It's when you look at it, I suppose in those terms, it's almost a classic kind of management consultancy kind of change management aspect. I don't think there's many kind of differences really. It's just the technical aspect of what needs to be done is where there's a bit more involvement and kind of understanding how kind of actual product designs can be changed is kind of getting into that nitty gritty, and then how that feeds back up. So there's almost a kind of different teams sometimes will speak very different kind of technical languages. So there's almost a role there for some sort of kind of facilitator, whether it's internal or external, to do a bit of a kind of translation piece between the kind of the business languages of the different teams, I suppose. I think that's where there's a real kind of point of what's the phrase I'm looking for? A point of difference that can kind of really very quickly unlock something. People can often be saying very similar things and having very similar ideas, but they're presenting them in different ways, and they don't quite understand what each other are trying to say. But then if somebody can just actually kind of unpick that and actually say, well, you're both saying the same thing with this slight tweak to what you're saying, we can move in that direction. And that's where the aha moments can come in. You say, actually, yeah, okay, that works. It works for us. It works for you. We just need to kind of change the way that we do this one little kind of process, whether it's a component testing process or a product testing process, or how we word a specific clause in our procurement contracts to get this kind of specific level of performance out of a specific component. And that's when you can kind of really begin to make quite quick progress in that kind of joined up thinking approach, I suppose.
I'd love to know a bit more about some of the sort of skills and training requirements. We've spoken quite a lot about policy and some of the sort of the ecosystems and collaboration and what have you. Specifically looking at, as you said there, Rob, around getting a greater appreciation across the skill metrics within the business of who does what and how one behaviour might impact another. Is there any particular training or tools that either of you have had success using?
It's a really interesting one. I think I don't have the answer to that in sense of one thing we're trying to do. Sorry, the fire alarm's testing just going off here. Hopefully you can't hear it. Good. So some things we're obviously trying to do within the university is to equip the next generation of people going out into business, into industry. And so I think a key thing in the sustainability space more broadly, of course, is just trying to avoid unintended consequences. I think that's a key aspect always, where something that can on the surface seem like a sensible approach actually ends up being, worse from a climate change perspective. I mean, I talk a lot about packaging because that's some of the area I've worked a lot in. And examples I think you can see in that is where we get these packaging items that might be kind of a paper outer with a plastic liner, or appearing more sustainable, so it works from a marketing perspective, but then because the volumes of these materials are small and they're multi-material, they can't be recycled. So I think the key thing we're trying to do there is equip students with the ability to try and look up and down, from the design perspective, up and down the supply chain. So what are the factors that look at that? I think, of course, life cycle analysis, life cycle assessment is a key tool as well there, isn't it? To actually try and quantify some of the impacts that happen. So in our projects, one of the things we do, and we do this with our SEAMS projects, and we do this in our Royce collaborative projects with industry, is we'll try to always build in a LCA perspective for the material. Say if we're looking at using recycled feedstock or recycling the material and being able to supply it into a different application, we'd want to do an LCA to benchmark how does it compare versus the status quo, so we can confirm this approach has a sustainability benefit. So that's one of the key things we try and do in our research.
Brilliant. We've got a couple of questions just popped through. I thought I would give you guys the opportunity to respond. So we've got a question here about how organisations can manage IP when they're working with co-funded sustainable collaborative research programs. So Thomas or Dan, either of you, I'm sure you've got experience in that space.
Dan, do you want to go first?
Please, Thomas. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And actually one that was solved before the conception of SEAMS, for the very reason that all centres involved in SEAMS have this as an ongoing requirement for continuing business operation. Why? Because all centres effectively offering innovation services out to a community that is generally has some basis of IP, whether it's process know-how, whether it's trade secrets, or whether it's some sort of patenting. What you cannot do in that instance when you're offering a business service like this, and SEAMS has replicated the great knowledge of managing such what we call conflicts, IP conflicts, is you have to have a conflict management system in place. You have to have a way of creating those division walls between projects and between project teams, so that you have no leakage of IP. Now, first and foremost, you do things properly. You set up the relationship with a non-disclosure agreement, and you can imagine the centres ourselves take these things very, very seriously, because it's fundamental to our continued business operation. We will then support those companies to develop the IP. In most instances, it's not our intention to develop IP as the centres unless explicitly discussed with the client. So how the funding is developed is quite key to those discussions. And if anyone's worked in collaborative research and development through, say, an Innovate UK funded call, you have those collaboration agreements, and that's when you set out those early discussions. So before IP is generated, you have a discussion around foreground and background IP, and you really set that understanding. And that's a business services discussion, but that's foundational before you start delving into problem solving, because at the back end there might be something significant. But in general, the centres are there to support emerging industry. We are there to help the creation of IP, job creation, inward investment for the community, and that's our result. That's our role. It's as much to support and protect on the basis of the SME than it is to necessarily create something for the centres. So I think the thing to take away is it's well thought through and it's secure. And actually, it depends on this bespoke basis of the project. But in general terms, it's about how do we get that business as far along the technology readiness level towards commercialization as possible, and that includes maintaining their IP for themselves. Did that answer the question?
I think, yeah. I mean, Rob, have you got anything? Thomas, have you got anything to add to that? I beg your pardon. With your work at Henry Royce?
Yeah, and I think, as Dan's Dan spoke to, I think he's covered really the key considerations there. I think from a university perspective, more broadly, universities love to work with companies because we do a lot of research, but one of the things we're assessed on in the university is how much impact our research has had in the real world. So actually helping companies exploit the work is a key aspect. And so our in the different collaboration agreements I've been involved with, we're always trying to make sure that the companies can exploit the results in their field, in their specific fields. We do try, and again, in any agreement, we try and have a balance. We want to try and make stuff as open source as possible, because as we talked about before, the more you can make things open source, the more opportunity there is to achieve scale. But again, we always balance that with what does this company need, what's this specific project need, and how do we make this actually something that can have as much impact in the real world as possible. So I think the thing is, universities, and particularly within SEAMS and within Royce, are well experienced in dealing with, these kind of collaboration aspects. And as Dan spoke to, we already have good frameworks in place for that. So it's something that is easy to work through.
Brilliant. And Rob, your thoughts on some successes you may have had in mitigating some of the concerns around IP?
Nothing really to add from me, to be honest, on what the guys have said there. I think they've kind of wrapped up everything nicely. I think, again, it's just kind of reiterating that point that Thomas made towards the end. It's finding the balance between ensuring that everybody involved in a collaborative effort is going to be able to kind of to reap the benefits of themselves in their own kind of individual contexts, but also that the kind of what learnings can be shared and kind of spread there are routes to do that as well. I think that's what we would always try to make sure we have that balance correct and get that the cooperation kind of laid out before a project starts, because you don't want to get towards the end and then start having those conversations when people know what the results might be. So I think it's getting the balance right, having the conversations as early as possible is the kind of the advice that I would give there.
Perfect. We've got another question here that's come through. It's probably geared towards Thomas and Dan around product passports. So do the speakers have any thoughts on the implementation of material passports and what challenges there would be for research institutions? Thomas.
Oh, me. I was hoping you're going to go to Dan first there. I think one of the things, as I mentioned before, we're actively pursuing is trying to create more standardization in recycled plastic. So we're working with standard organizations. We're working with we're trying to create some new projects with the National Physical Labs, who focus in measurement, who are also a partner in SEAMS, to look at how we can, better understand the key characteristics and make sure those are ones that are recorded and shared along the supply chain. And so, yeah, I think from a research institution perspective, I think universities and the Henry Royce are well positioned because we have that expertise in materials. We have excellent characterization capability. So we can also provide the evidence base to inform some of those aspects of standardization and passporting. I think we of course really want to work with the sector to understand what that means. But I think that would be kind of my answer. Dan, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
That's brilliant, Thomas. Thank you. Material passports. I haven't kept up how far down the line this had been developed, but for me, when it was the term was first coined, it had many different meanings. So it either has, from a mechanical or physical properties, it has a meaning, but also from a sustainability aspect, it has a meaning. In terms of performance, I mean, you just take something like British Steel. It's known to be some of the highest quality steel there is, and you want to make sure that you source the right steel when building the right bridge. So there are certain aspects, and SEAMS definitely falls within this, because we're in the advanced materials space. So it's engineering polymers. It's the kind of things that you would build something structural that has to have that level of performance. Otherwise, there's significant liability. So it's, how do you know that your material, that if it's a secondary raw material and it's come from a first generation life, still retains those mechanical and physical properties? So is it going to snap? Is it going to bend? Has it become more brittle? That's absolutely critical when it comes to overcoming the liabilities of who you're selling it into. And I think there needs to be on both sides a responsibility of and I call it sleeping policeman. In process engineering, you have a sleeping policeman in that says, we know that when this material left our gate, it had the performance of X, and that's what we're selling against. And then the company that buys it in effectively has to retest before it goes into building a building or building a bridge, because again, you have to overcome those unknowns, that maybe the material that you're using on that construction project or in that product isn't fit for purpose. So how material passports achieve that's there's possibly some opportunity there for blockchain and some sort of track and trace that could help to overcome. You still need the characterization in order to be able to assess whether a material is fit for purpose. And Thomas will tell you widely, we still don't quite have that in the plastics recycling at the moment, because as every time a plastic is mechanically recycled, the polymer chains start to break down, and mechanically it reduces in performance. And that's why we put in some virgin material just to lift up the mechanical and physical properties of those polymers. So is it okay to continue to keep adding virgin material? If you still have recycled material in there, then what's the risk of that existing material being in that new product? So is there a migratory risk of from the recycled content into the new product? So going, in terms of how Thomas talks in terms of packaging, is there a migratory risk from packaging to product from recycling content? And if that product is foodstuffs or a pharma stuff, it's significant. But likewise, is there a risk from product to packaging? Say if you had foodstuffs that had some sort of allergen in, and also now how do you know that allergen no longer resides within that material when it's going on to future use? So I think when you start applying material passports, it's understanding where the material is sourced from, and equally when it comes to sustainability, you don't want palm oil come from poorly sourced and detrimental agricultural practices. But it's how do you track that material through its life cycle into its second life, and also the conversion technologies that upgrade or downgrade the material into the new life. And so you have aspects for advanced recycling, such as chemical recycling. Instead of mechanically recycling something, you're breaking it down into its constituent building blocks and reforming it again. And that could bring you closer to those virgin-like qualities that Thomas mentioned earlier, that almost helps to obviate that liability of how the material passport needs to behave, and that additional cost in testing and characterization in the supply chain. Ideally, you have that testing throughout the supply chain, and you're able to map and monitor that material as it progresses through multiple lives, so you can retire it. But it's a difficult question and comes with many levels of complexities, and it's an understanding of the conversion technologies and recycling technologies, as well as the material science and where those feedstocks originally came from. So it's a great question, and I think the debate is going to rumble on a bit longer than that until the science community has worked out how to do this properly.
Yeah, we've been talking about distributed ledger technologies and the blockchain for a long time, almost as a technology looking for a problem, and this really feels like something that it could really be used in anger. So yeah, I'm really excited to see how we can leverage that as a tool. Another question here. We've spoken a lot about this has piqued my interest because it's looking slightly differently at the conversation we're having. So we've spoken a lot about internal collaboration and collaboration between different ecosystems. Got a question here about how you can engage consumers in the circular economy efforts. What strategies work best to get consumers on board, and how can you build trust and transparency? Rob, if I could start with you.
It's a nice easy one to finish off with, I suppose. How do we bring the rest of society along with what the way we want it to go? There's a few different kind of ways you can approach it. I think it kind of comes back in a way to what we're talking about, the kind of the underlying measure of value, or the underlying understanding of how we measure value in society. So there's lots of kind of communication and engagement pieces that can potentially be done around that, just to make the case for that kind of bigger picture of kind of thinking about the externalities, and definitely not using the term externalities because that's going to frighten people off. Kind of frankly, just thinking about how best to kind of communicate that message of what you actually see in your end product isn't the whole story of that product. It's come from somewhere. All of the individual components have come from somewhere, and they're all going to have to go somewhere when you're finished using it, basically. So there's a huge kind of education and kind of engagement and kind of just kind of message kind of widening piece to be done around that. How do you do that? There is the kind of classic examples of the 5-a-day campaigns. That sticks in everybody's mind. Everybody knows that it's something that you should do now. Everybody knows it. Not everybody does it, but a lot more people do it than used to before that campaign. Same with any kind of public health campaigns, kind of smoking campaigns, seat belts, anything you can think of. It's that kind of bringing the majority along, and there are always going to be a few kind of people who kind of rail against it or don't quite get the message and kind of don't come with you. But if you can bring more people along than you would do otherwise, and that's kind of one potential way. There's obviously nudge theory, which is I imagine most people in the audience will have an idea of nudge theory, but that's just not so much kind of bash you over the head with this kind of public information campaign, but it's things like kind of flyers that come out in your kind of council tax bills or kind of pay slips, that kind of thing. It's just little bits of information that aren't necessarily kind of fully targeted, but just things that will kind of make you think and kind of nudge people in the right direction. And there's probably kind of a lot of academics will kind of be able to go into a lot more kind of detail on nudge theory than me. But I think one of the major ways that we can begin to just develop an understanding and appreciation of the benefits of the circular economy at large are in kind of working through the potential kind of social benefits of the circular economy as well. So working through community kind of organizations and community kind of initiatives on things like repair shops or kind of repair kind of skills workshops, that kind of thing as well, or technology sharing rings, kind of machinery sharing rings, or kind of phrase I'm looking for, tool libraries. So if you're aware that you kind of need a specific kind of tool for a job, not everybody has to have that drill that they use maybe 3 or 4 times a year that sits underneath the stairs for the rest of the time. If you know there's a tool library in your kind of local town, you can go and see, well, I'll use that drill. And then you'll meet some other people while you're there, and you'll have a chat about how this is a great thing to be doing. You don't have to spend the money on it. The material's getting used, basically. So it's community kind of initiatives and the potential community benefits of ideas around circularity that will begin to kind of to spread that as a just something which is more in the public consciousness. We don't all need to have a car sitting outside all the time. There might be some way that we can look at kind of vehicle sharing or kind of carpooling with other people that come into the office on the same days that I do, or my neighbours often make the same trip as me, so maybe we can kind of share the responsibility that way. So there are kind of outward messages that can come down from government levels or from organizations like ours, big kind of communication campaigns, but they're only going to have so much kind of effect and nowhere near as much effect as actually involving people in the activities that we're talking about as well. So through communities and kind of allowing people to feel the benefits, both to their wallets at the end of the day, which is going to be most important for a lot of people, but also the potential social benefits through greater engagement with their community and kind of making friends and learning new skills, repair skills, that kind of thing. And also if you can tie along with that some messaging around the environmental benefits of the activities that they're doing, then it's that little kind of endorphin tick. It's when you see on your kind of Google Maps kind of route planner that going this way uses a little bit less carbon than going this way. So a lot of people will kind of take that route because of that as well. So I think it's engagement and involvement, actually kind of rolling these things out in practice, that are going to have the best chance of success in kind of spreading the circularity message through communities and consumers.
I think can I just add quickly on the back of that? So yeah, one of the things we've actually done in a few projects, I didn't lead one of these projects, but I think it's a nice example, is building in social science research into the materials project itself. So what we try and do is look at, an example is look at how different consumers or people in one of the things we're looking at is how say people in labs could recycle different plastics, what streams they could use in terms of waste streams. So one of the key things we're going to do in that project is actually do a social science element, understand what are the driving forces for why people can and can't or are less willing to segregate things, and then understand the value in that recycled feedstock. So I think the thing is there's often a big driving force towards education of consumers, and I think that's key. You can, as Rob's taught, to change some of the behaviors, but also critically understanding why consumers behave in certain ways, what are the factors that drive them, allow us to maybe either design processes that better align to the way they understand things, or better design things to align to their values. So I think that's something, again, there's really exciting collaboration opportunities around that, because you can pull in a company and carry out research to help inform some of the materials parts and also some of the social science part.
Fantastic. Dan, have you got anything before we wrap up? Anything to add to that on that piece?
This is like, it splits me in half, this question, Nick, because on one hand I said I feel it's stop blaming the consumers for the way the world is. Most things are B2B, business to business, and it's very rarely B2C, business to consumer. And so, and even when it's business to consumer, provide the consumer with the options to do the right thing, and more times than not, they will do the right thing. And I think over the last 10 years, if we look at what's on the shelves in our supermarkets or where we buy our goods from, there's actually not been the options on the shelves. Whether it's a non-gluten aisle or it's a free from aisle, we've only seen those things creep in very slowly, and now they've expanded over time. So now we have a big push into vegan foods. In packaging, because I work a bit in packaging like Thomas, we're actually seeing a big shift, and that's been pushed by extended producer responsibility and the plastic tax. Large organizations are realizing that they have to produce better options for the consumer to do the right thing, and therefore we are actually seeing movement in this direction, and the consumer will do the right thing, because the cost of the packaging compared to the cost of the product is fairly minor more often than not, but it hurts more the big multinational than it does necessarily the consumer. We're seeing things move with packaging. Packaging is a great way for multinationals to communicate with the consumer, because it is your message piece. You've got things like barcodes and QR codes. You've got things you can zap with mobile phones. You can jump onto websites. You can get more details on a product and trace it right back to its origin than we've ever been able to do. We have things like in the pharma community moving away from standard leaflets to e-leaflets. So digital technologies are creeping in. That's going to help that communication from multinationals to the consumer. Remember, we have things like nectar points and we already have these. So multinationals are understanding what behaviors are, and they're very good at choosing how to influence. We need to get the multinationals to influence in the right way. But I actually think that the consumer could be the savior of the circular economy for the very reason that the consumer, if it chooses to change behavior, and I fundamentally believe if you change the material, you can change the behavior, you can change the system, and it goes in that order. But reuse is right at the top there on the waste hierarchy, and that willingness to take around your reusable coffee cup, and it's as simple as stop supplying coffee cups in disposables at coffee places, so you have to sit down and enjoy your coffee, or turn up with your reusable. We do it with bags, and actually the plastic bag tax, whether you like it or not, has had benefits. People do, but not everyone is going to be engaged in the system, and therefore we have to be sensible about the type of materials that we as large organizations place on the market, because it doesn't matter how good your recycling and reuse system is, there will be environmental leakage. And if it gets into the environment, it needs to become food for nature within a reasonable time period, as the same way as Ellen MacArthur, when she was rowing all the way across the Pacific, she saw it that nature always recycles. But if we're producing materials that can't be recycled by nature, we have a challenge, and that's the challenge to overcome. So yes, we need more engagement from the consumer. Yes, we've got to give the consumer a break, but understand that the consumer has so many life pressures on them already that we need to make it easy for them to do the right thing. And when they don't, we need the fail-safe in the science to be compatible with Earth planetary boundaries.
Brilliant. Fantastic. And I'm just conscious of the time. This is taking us right up towards the tail end of the session now, so I appreciate everyone being so good with your answers. Just before I just offer the final words to you all, Rob, I'd love to know what your biggest takeaway from today is, and one thing you'd like to leave our listeners with, and Dan and Thomas, how people can get involved with Seams and Henry Royce. It's worth noting also that this is the Sustainable Industry Digital Platform. We have an in-person event that Henry Royce and Seams are going to be involved with. That is Sustainable Industry Live. That's on the 6th of November at the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester. Tickets are free, and you can have deep dive conversations with both of the teams there from Seams and Henry Royce. So if there's anything that's left unanswered from today, you have another bite of the cherry, as it were, on the 6th of November, and details for that event will be supplied in the follow-up to this call. So Rob, if I can start with you, your takeaway from today, one piece of advice for people listening.
I don't think I'll be able to do as good a job as Dan did on kind of summing up the kind of the aspiration of the conversation and what we're all trying to do there. I think, yeah, just kind of reiterating that point, if we are able to give people the right options and the type of engagement that we were talking about before, whether that's within businesses, between sectors, between industry and kind of public bodies, giving people those options and the level of engagement, people will make the right decisions. People will be conscious consumers, basically, and kind of look for, if they're in the habit of kind of making those right decisions because they're put right before them, then in other kind of purchasing decisions that they have, they'll begin to look for what the right options are as well. It's a habit building thing. So I think that kind of sums up the conversation nicely. It's giving people the options and allowing that kind of open communication is key to it all, like we said right at the top.
Fantastic, thank you. And Dan, if I could ask you, how can people get involved with Seams?
Please come and see us. If you have a problem and you want support to find the right solutions, pathways to commercialization, and you don't want to be investing ridiculous amounts of monies in capex items, capital items that effectively puts you in the valley of death. Understand that there is a community already in existence that's there to support you, and we are brilliantly funded by the public purse, and thank you to Rochdale Development Agency. If it wasn't for their real excitement and enthusiasm to support a programme like this, then we would not be here to have this conversation to support you in this way. So please do come and use us, and feel free to come and contribute to this wider activity, which is circular economy.
Wonderful. And Thomas, same to you.
Yeah, I just literally will just say the same thing Dan said. So again, like we in terms of academics in the university sector and within the Henry Royce Institute are really keen to collaborate. And so there's a really strong crossover and collaboration between SEAMS and the Royce. So please get in touch. Yeah, our business engagement teams you can just find on the Henry Royce website. And please, yeah, there we go. Michelle's just put the link in the chat. And yeah, come along to the event, or just get in touch, and be really keen to collaborate and drive a circular economy going forward. So thanks, everyone.
Wonderful, thank you. And yeah, thank you to everyone. And just to underline the fact that all of the links to all the different projects that have been discussed today will be supplied to you in the post-event notes. If you want to have a more detailed conversation with the teams on the call today, please do come along to the Sustainable Industry live event on the 6th of November in Manchester. Finally, just left for me to say thank you so much for everyone that's joined today and our contributors for all of the prep. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.